Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Tokyo Living Podcast. We're very happy to have our resident physician, Dr. Tom Lomax, back on the show. Tom, thanks for coming back on tonight.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
How's your 200? This is later than I usually do these episodes. 2023 going for you so far?
Yeah, no, it's going well so far. Yeah, it's kind of busy, but it's nice to sort of see Tokyo returning to like more pre-COVID, more people coming back in again, new people relocating, more tourists. So yeah, I'm enjoying that.
We've got you on today to talk about glucose monitoring. Being in the health and wellness and fitness space, we've seen a massive rise in the different types of technology that's used to monitor health-related metrics, from the basic information that you can get from your smartphone to other wearables such as smartwatches and rings that are providing more and more data that people can use to monitor different aspects of their health. Now, glucose monitoring is probably in the next level up in terms of the technology and I guess the invasiveness involved in monitoring a health-related outcome or health-related metric. So I think it'd be good to just talk a little bit about what this is about and just get your sort of take on it from a doctor's perspective. Perhaps if you can just start by talking about what glucose monitoring is, the history. Obviously, it's been used up until now primarily for diabetics, and just in as simple terms as possible, just sort of the basic physiology behind what it's actually measuring.
Yeah, so I mean, exactly. This is something that was used for diabetics. So I mean, if you sort of go back, I don't know, decades. If you were diabetic, you would monitor your blood sugar. You check your blood sugar with a finger prick. So you just have a tiny little needle, stick it in your finger, squeeze your finger, drop of blood would come out, and then you'd have a sort of portable reader device that would tell you what your blood sugar was. And diabetics would always kind of complain that they had to stab themselves, 6, 8, 10 times a day to track their sugar. So I think it's about 10 years ago now. A few companies developed real-time continuous monitoring devices, basically to make diabetics' lives easier. So instead of stabbing yourself in the finger multiple times a day, you'd have a thing that's like a disc about the size of a 500 yen coin. And you just stick it on the back of your arm. And it has a tiny little needle, like almost a little filament, that goes through your skin. So, I mean, actually, when you put it on, most people say they don't feel anything, but it is just making a tiny little piercing in your skin. And the device will measure your blood sugar every 2 minutes. So, you're sort of seeing what your blood sugar is doing in real time. So that was helping diabetics to sort of time their therapy, and also if they were on insulin to decide how much insulin they needed. Recently, and I think this has really sort of taken off in the last year or two, people have started to use continuous glucose monitoring if they're not diabetic to see what their sugar's doing just sort of through their daily routine. And I mean, this is one of these things that we haven't so much been suggesting that patients do, that people have sort of heard about it and come to us and said that they're interested in and want to try out. So kind of in the interest of getting as much experience about it as possible, I actually did a week of continuous monitoring myself in January, which I found was very interesting, actually.
Yeah. And so from physiological perspective, what are we looking at when we're getting the readings from these devices?
So, I mean, your system's ideally trying to keep your glucose level. So, obviously, we're not constantly eating tiny amounts of food. We're eating a bolus of food. And what our body wants to do is break that down and manage it so that our blood sugar stays more or less level. But, increasingly as we get older and individually, we sometimes struggle with that. So, if you eat a lot of, I mean, most obviously, if you have a lot of sugar, for example, if you sort of drink like a liter of soda, of a sugary drink, then your blood sugar is obviously going to shoot up in response to that. and then your body will decide there's too much sugar around, it's got to be stored, so you'll release a lot of insulin, and the insulin will drive your sugar down, try to get it back to baseline. So through the day, depending on what you're eating, you're going to see your sugar sort of trending up and down. And obviously the things that will sort of seriously derange it will be large volumes of sugar and large volumes of carbohydrate. So if you eat like 200 grams of pasta, for example, your body's going to struggle to keep your blood sugar flat if you do that. Now, I mean, why should you care? So what? Your sugar's going up and down. You'll actually feel that. So particularly if your sugar drops very abruptly, then you may feel kind of lethargic, tired. You may struggle to focus because your brain's been operating in a very high glucose environment, and suddenly the amount of glucose available to it drops. So, your brain is really the bit of your body that wants the glucose the most, so it responds the most to sudden changes. So I think most of us know what that feels like, right? If you eat a very big lunch and you feel tired afterwards, right? And that's your sugar dropping down because of all the insulin sort of soaking it all up.
From a sort of a sports performance and fitness perspective, that's sort of been associated with an inability to use different fuel sources. So I guess the typical recommendation has been that if you have that response to a moderate carbohydrate meal, that you do feel lethargic, that you do feel that your energy levels are reduced, then you're not using the carbohydrates that well as a fuel. What sort of information are you gleaning that might then impact dietary interventions or lifestyle interventions or habits based on the responses that people might get to this monitoring?
I think the main thing is that people's response to carbohydrate loads is quite individual. So one person might actually maintain a relatively level blood sugar with a particular carbohydrate source. So, I mean, the thing that I found interesting when I did this is I was eating a lot of oatmeal for lunch, because we've always told people that oatmeal is low glycemic index, so it won't release all the sugar very, very quickly. But actually, people's response to foods that are thought of as low glycemic index is quite variable. And if I eat a substantial amount of oatmeal, my sugar just zooms up, it turns out. So oatmeal doesn't really work for me as a low glycemic index food. And I mean, individually for me, that taught me that I had to sort of fraction my carbohydrate load more effectively through the day.
And do people sort of respond differently to different types of carbohydrates, or is it generally just the overall volume in a certain eating window?
I mean, people respond individually to volume. So, I mean, we know there's a very strong genetic component to developing type 2 diabetes, which is basically, when your body completely becomes unable to manage high carbohydrate loads. And I mean, probably people who are genetically predisposed to type 2 diabetes. So if you've got 2 diabetic grandparents, then you're predisposed probably. Those people are going to manage high loads of carbohydrates less well generally. And again, I mean, that's something that develops with age. So you might find that in your 20s or 30s, your body manages to process, store, and maintain stable blood sugars with high carbohydrate loads. But as you get into your 40s and 50s, it increasingly struggles. So there's genetic variability, there's variability with age, and there is an individual response to different carbohydrates. So, I mean, all of us will respond more or less the same way to 100 grams of sugar, right? Because that's not being broken down at all. That's literally just being absorbed straight into our bloodstream. And that happens at a fairly predictable rate very quickly. Carbohydrates are long chains of sugar. And for them to cause your blood sugar to rise, they've got to be broken down. And there is some individual variability in the speed at which we break down the carbohydrate chains, yes. And you'll find that different people respond to different carbohydrate sources in different ways. And also, the other thing that's worth saying is, I think increasingly, the order in which you eat your meal as well. So if you start off with a large bolus of carbohydrate, that's just going straight into your small bowel. So it's going to get broken down, digested very quickly, and it's going to send your blood sugar spiking up, at a rate of knots. If you eat more slowly, and if you start off by eating lower carbohydrate foods, like if you started off by eating vegetables or salad and then ate the carbohydrates at the end of the meal, you'd find that they get processed much more slowly.
Would that be the same for like proteins and fats, or is it more the fiber in the vegetables that sort of helps most with that? I guess we're sort of talking on to more onto sort of nutritional interventions, but as a general rule.
I mean, I think it's the sort of speed at which you get the carbohydrates into your small bowel. So if you've got an empty stomach, that's going to be very quick. So I think if you did eat sort of some protein or fat first, then put the carbohydrates on the end, your blood sugar would rise more slowly and would be more controllable. So, I mean, I did a kaiseki ryori, like a sort of 10-course Japanese meal where you always get a little bit of carbohydrates at the end. And that, I mean, my blood sugar just stayed completely flat through the whole time I was doing that, even though it was actually quite a large meal, sort of 10 courses, but the carbs were all at the end.
Yeah. And how would you expect other lifestyle factors like sleep and exercise or even stress levels to influence the way in which you respond to the carbohydrate intake?
I mean, I think it's kind of more interesting to look at it the other way around. So how will your way you consume carbohydrates affect your sleep, for example?
Yep.
And again, I mean, a lot of us, particularly if we're busy, work late, come home very hungry, and then eat a lot of carbohydrates late in the evening, probably not going to sleep very well afterwards. I mean, if you can let me put it up, I'll show you the first day I did a continuous monitoring, because you go to bed with a massive load of carbohydrates inside. Of course, you feel very tired and fall asleep. But then your sugar will drop down, often quite precipitously, and you may actually have sort of transient hypoglycemic episodes in your sleep, which are going to mean you're going to have a less restful sleep. So I think, I mean, that's one thing. And then the other thing that you mentioned is stress. And I mean, yes, we know that cortisol, for example, independently pushes your sugar up. So, sort of stressful life events or stressful days at work or whatever will actually, almost independently of your glucose intake, will cause your sugar to spike up as well. But then if you throw sugar on top of that, so, if you're struggling to keep up at work, very busy, and then your response to that is to eat a lot of sugary snacks, then that really is going to send your sugar all over the place, because you've got the combination of the stress hormones, the cortisol, plus the sugar on top of that.
Yeah. And then exercise. I mean, if you are exercising, would that theoretically you think that would improve your ability to control?
I got some of my highest sugars at your place in the mornings. I don't eat. I just go into the gym. So I'm going in and I'm fasted for like 8 or 9 hours, and then doing a fairly intensive workout. And I was really surprised at how much my sugar went up. Although I didn't seem to get the precipitous drops afterwards, because that's your sugar rising in response to cortisol and adrenaline. And that releases a lot of the stores that you've got. So your glycogen gets broken down and released, but you don't get this then big sort of pulse of insulin to suck it all back in again. So you get like a peak, but then you don't get a deep trough afterwards. So I could sort of see the difference there.
I understand you've actually got some visual graphics of the metrics that you took. Are you able to share those with us now? For
those of you who are on Vision.
Yep.
Yeah. So I'm just going to put this one up. This is the first day, and this actually was the one that really surprised me and made me realize that maybe I could do a little bit better on how I manage my carbohydrate loads. So this is the first day after I had the sensor on. There you can see the date, 27th of January. So the night before, I can't remember what I had, but it was a lot of carbohydrates. And then you can see at about 1 o'clock in the morning, my blood sugar dropped down to 40, right? And it goes down into the red zone. And then, you have a stress response to that, because low blood sugar is quite bad for you. So then a load of stress hormones are released and your sugar sort of spikes back up again. So it went from 40 to 100, and then it went back down again to 40 again at 3 o'clock in the morning. So I'm pretty sure I had a very disturbed, restless sleep then.
Yeah.
And that's just my response to eating a lot of carbs late in the evening. Then the following morning, I was down at your place, and there you can see, like 7 o'clock in the morning, I've got this kind of cortisol burst, sort of cortisol adrenaline spike. So my sugar went up to sort of 180 on an empty stomach just from exercising. But then it sort of trended gradually down. And then I had a few very big spikes later on the day. I had like a big lunch, I think. I went out and had like a naan bread and some curry for lunch, and then a lot of carbohydrates in the dinner. You can see for dinner, and you can see my sugars kind of jacking up from sort of 160 down to 100, then up to 180 with meals. And I do remember feeling quite kind of knocked off when I was hitting those troughs. So I sort of looked at that and I thought, wow, I'm really not handling these big loads of carbohydrates very well. But I mean, thinking about it didn't really come as a surprise. You know, there's a lot of diabetes in my family. You know, I talked to friends who'd done the same monitoring, and they didn't get as much of this kind of exaggerated spiking. So it was useful for me, and it sort of taught me to think a bit more about the composition of my meals, and particularly not doing sort of meals that were front loaded with a lot of carbohydrates.
Yeah. And is that, I mean, you mentioned that one kaiseki meal that had the carbohydrates at the end. Over the course of the week, there's sort of examples of where that's been, I guess, better controlled, and do you know what? Yeah.
So this is like with a bit of you know, trial and error.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's still sort of, you know, fluctuating, but within a much narrower range. I think this is the kaiseki day. So again, I got that big spike in the morning from exercising, but you know, I felt fine after that. And then I was sort of eating less carbohydrates and more slowly during the day, so I didn't get as much spiking. And my sort of sugars were trending into a much narrower band, and I actually felt better when I was doing that. I felt, you know, less kind of less dopey in the afternoons and evenings, and generally, you know, a little bit better in myself.
Yeah. Let's say there's people listening that may already be using this. Are there sort of values in terms of normal ranges? Obviously, if you're looking at the graphic here on the video version of this, you can see that there's this sort of green range. Is there a range where people or you as someone's doctor would be concerned about the amount of spike and then perhaps the amount of dip after this?
I mean, there's two things to that, right? One is, are you feeling bad or suffering ill effects on the day? So if your sugar's dropping below 70, you're probably not going to be feeling very good. So you're having these kind of hypoglycemic you know, spells. I mean, your system will self-correct from that unless you're type 1 diabetic who's giving yourself insulin. So it's not immediately dangerous, but you can sort of see that you're going to feel unwell then. And I guess if you're an athlete doing like long endurance events and your sugar's starting to drop down, then, you know, you're sort of running on empty basically. At the other end, these are US units, by the way. This is milligrams per deciliter. You know, ideally you want to keep your sugar in that sort of 90 to 150 band. I mean, it's not actively dangerous if it goes up to, you know, 180, 200, unless it's doing that for extended periods of time. So if you have type 2 diabetes, you know, you'll eat a carbohydrate load, your sugar will go up to like 200 or 220. And then 6 hours later, it still hasn't really come down because you're just no longer able to, you know, process the sugar and store it, or not as effectively as you should be able to. Now that, again, isn't going to sort of kill you. You're not going to keel over or go into a coma or anything. But over the course of years, that will have a number of adverse health consequences. So that will damage your blood vessels, basically. I mean, the lining of your blood vessels, you know, the cells there are going to get whacked if they've got too much sugar sort of constantly bathing them. So in the long term, people with poorly controlled sugar, type 2 diabetics, will get vessel disease causing, you know, heart disease, stroke, kidney damage.
Yeah,
but not that happens over years, not days.
Yeah. But is this sort of one of the main utilities that you can see this type of monitoring being useful is perhaps picking up early risk factors of these sort of conditions, or is it for the majority of people that are using it more just a general optimizing of performance by altering your dietary habits?
I mean, it's originally designed for managing type 2 and type 1 diabetes. So that's what it's been designed for. But it's now finding utility in, certainly for me, people like me with I'm 52 and I've got a family history of diabetes. I can see that unless I'm careful about my carbohydrate loads, that within 10 to 15 years, I'll have type 2 diabetes. So it does provide early warning for people who are vulnerable, and it lets you start to think about lifestyle interventions, before you start to run into problems. So maybe 10 years ago, you'd pick up these changes much later on when they were a bit harder to correct. So it's got that sort of early warning utility. But even for people who are not worried about developing type 2 diabetes, even for people who are sort of young, healthy, and active, I think it will still help people manage their carbohydrate loads more effectively because they can see in real time exactly what's happening after each meal. So, I mean, if you just want to maintain optimal fitness and avoid kind of, dropping off in terms of productivity and concentration in the afternoons, I think it's quite useful for that. And, you don't need to be doing this constantly. I mean, one of these monitors will last for about 14 days, but you can just do it once and see what you're like for those 14 days and then maybe repeat it, 6 months or a year later, perhaps.
I guess that was going to be my next question, the logistics of it. How big is it? You sort of described before how it attaches to the skin, but is there issues with clothing and it's sticking there? And what activities can people can't people do if people are like, if I was to try and do aggressive jiu-jitsu, would it stay in place? How does that work?
So, I mean, it's supposed to be a really robust system and it's like super sticky. So it's supposed to sort of stay on. And one of the other doctors I work with did it before me. And she said that she exercised 3 or 4 times a week, went swimming, went to the gym, and it lasted for 14 days with no problems. I have to say mine fell off after 7 days, and that was boxing.
Really?
So I think martial arts is probably the one thing that maybe it's not going to hold up to quite as well. And whether you should sort of bandage it or something, if you're doing any kind of grappling or striking sports, I guess you should give some consideration to that. But it's supposed to be, completely robust for an active lifestyle.
Yeah. And can it attach to any part of the body?
Yeah, I mean, it'll, it's just going into the interstitial fluid. So, I mean, theoretically, it'll work wherever you put it, and you can sort of figure out for yourself what the optimum location is. I think the recommendation is kind of basically over the triceps. Yeah, it's sort of here. You don't want it sticking out the side of your arm because then it's likely to catch things. So kind of, but you don't want it right up in your armpit either. So yeah, sort of mid upper arm over the triceps is probably the sort of recommended location.
Yeah. And at the moment, these are only by doctor's prescription.
Well, I mean, they are in Japan, but I mean, we're starting to see in other countries that they're being, they've sort of moved from medical devices into just sort of, the health, the wearable technology, health and fitness market. So I'm aware that in the States, you can just buy them without any kind of doctor's intervention. Just get the sensor, apply it yourself, and increasingly you're just reading them with your phone. So the screenshots I showed you, I mean, you just download an app, put your details in, and then you just hold the phone against the device. So at the moment, if you wanted to get one in Japan, yes, it would have to be prescribed by a doctor. I'm fairly certain that in the very near future they'll be easy to source. Certainly in Europe and in the States, just on the open market, you'll probably be able to buy them on Amazon before too long, and maybe even have them. Although I guess still, if you wanted to have them shipped into Japan, they're still classified as medical devices, so you might have some customs issues. But you could certainly go home and buy them and bring them back with you. That wouldn't be a problem. Yeah.
And so, how much do these generally cost?
So I haven't looked at what the prices are in the States, but In Japan, the sensors run to about 8,000 yen. So that's a sensor that will last you for 2 weeks, give you 2 weeks of data. Yeah, so they're not eye-wateringly expensive, and particularly if you're not doing it. I mean, if you're diabetic, the idea is you've got one on like the whole of your life, so you're constantly changing them every 14 days. But if you're doing it more to sort of assess your response to diet and exercise, you just want to do it as a single 2-week exercise to give yourself an idea.
Yeah, yeah. Excellent. Great. That's some really interesting information. Anything else people should know about these devices?
I mean, I think that sort of more or less covers it, really. I think they're interesting. They give you some, sort of further information, and people who have the issues we've discussed, like sort of lethargy or these sort of responses to their diets, can get a lot more, really granular information. I think from my perspective, what I'm interested to see is once these move into sort of mainstream use from just as a medical device, what else will people figure out how to put into the sensor? So at the moment, it's just reading your glucose, but clearly there's the potential to add more channels to detect more than one thing. So I'll be very interested to see, if we start to see sensors that can actually read other data as well. Maybe, I mean, measuring things like hormones is more difficult, but certainly like electrolytes is, I think, is probably doable, maybe in the next decade or two.
Yeah, I can see obviously the open AI thing has crept into everyone's space in the last month or so, and I can see you being a little bit concerned about your job, that people can no, you don't have to go to a doctor to get a blood test or anything these days. You just put a device on and your phone will read it all for you.
Well, I mean, we're already seeing that. There's already, and I think we just have to accept that that's the way things are going. I think I'll probably still have a job for a while to go yet.
Yeah, I agree. Well, thanks as always, Tom, for your sharing your expertise, and most importantly, your time with us. Much appreciated, and look forward to having you on the show again soon.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Always a pleasure, and hopefully speak to you again soon.